Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker shills, debt slaves, search peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks, historians. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome, and let's go back in time. And let's go back in time to a very unusual event that I think has relevance these days because it's such an unusual event, and it kind of helps explain how shifting winds in the Middle East can change things dramatically, and that friendships and alignments can change dramatically, and we end up often with strange bedfellows. And one of the things that's been notable about the whole situation in Syria, for example, right now, is all the strange bedfellows we see aligning. And there's a long, long history of this, and particularly in that region. Both sides, or I should say all sides, operating in self-interest and making alignments of convenience. And in this case, it's the very unusual story of how Iran and Israel got together to bomb Iraq back in the 80s. And so, like I say, that's shocking just to hear that arrangement, particularly because we're not talking about the Shah here. We are talking about the Khomeini radical fundamentalist Islamic government of Iran working with Israel to bomb a mutual enemy, Iraq. And so the story goes that in September 30th, 1980, Operation Scorched Sword, and this is when Iran attacked an Iraqi nuclear reactor, and they wanted to damage the structures, but didn't want to actually bomb the reactor. And they actually had Israel urging them on. Of course, this was during the shortly after the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq War back in the 80s, a decade-long slaughter that happened in that region, which is also another story that a lot of people need to keep in mind when looking at events that unfold in the Middle East today. And the Iranians met with the Israelis prior to the next phase, a 1981 Israeli strike, and an agreement that Israeli planes could land in Iran. So that just adds another layer of strangeness once again. So now we have, decades ago, we have Israeli planes landing in Iran. The fundamentalist Khomeini regime in Iran letting Israeli planes land there in order to bomb Iraq. And this they did in June 7th, 1981, in Operation Opera. The Israelis bombed the Iraqi nuclear plant 10 miles from Baghdad and in a 1,000-mile trip and destroyed the nuclear plant there. And they've been planning to do this since 1976. So this is something that became convenient in guise of this Iran-Iraq war. So another layer of the story, obviously, is Israel being able to use this situation and this war between Iran and Iraq in order to exploit its own self-interest of destroying this Iraqi nuclear plant. So funny how that works out for them sometimes. And so now we have what's called the Begin Doctrine, a precedent for every future government of Israel being able to do these preemptive strikes. And obviously this is the model that we see adopted by the United States now. So that's another important part of this story, is this preemptive strike that's done to further your own interests in a country you're not even having a war with. And so that definitely is a precursor to a policy we see all over the world now, and not necessarily just the United States, of course, because we see it being adopted by other countries as well. But in 1976, Iraq purchased the reactor from France, and they even signed on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Israel hasn't. And France and Iraq said it was for peaceful use, and the Iraqis said it was for nuclear weapons. The same old argument that we always hear, of course. And then they were roundly condemned around the world by the U.S., the United Nations, and the media for this preemptive strikes. And in fact, the L.A. Times called it state-sponsored terrorism that Israel would even make this strike. So interesting how things play out in different times in history, and how the who is the aggressor and who is the victim can change radically. And that same blueprint was actually repeated with an Israeli strike on Syria on September 6, 2007, Operation Orchard. And they bombed a site believed to be a nuclear reactor. And it wasn't until 2011 that the International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed that it indeed was a nuclear reactor. But once again, an example of preemptive strikes and a combat action against a country you're not currently involved in combat or at war with, and having that be the state policy, the Begin Doctrine, they called it there, and now it's something that we use, of course. The U.S. wouldn't do it and bomb Syria, so they coordinated with the Bush administration and did it. And no controversy, as Israel kept it secret, as did Syria. So at the time, it just wasn't politically expeditious for either country. So that's another interesting thing about international relations, and we see that now. For example, when the Russian jet was shot down and Russia showed an amazing amount of restraint, there's only the amount of controversy that people want to politically milk out of a situation oftentimes. So that's something to bear in mind. But even when Israel bombed Syria, they had special forces on the ground, so we can assume they had special forces on the ground in Iraq as well. And so once again, operating in another country with your military forces and your special forces, and you're not even at war or in active combat with them. So anyway, there's a little interesting little part of history that might surprise some people, and I just want to do a video on, just because such an interesting alignment and such an excellent example of how things can change dramatically. And it looks like in 2017 we might see that again if the United States ends up aligning with Assad in Syria, the government we've been trying to topple for 5 or 6 years now, and then aligning with Russia, who has been demonized as the United States arch enemy for the last few years. So blueprint for the future in the past. Again, I'm Useful Idiot. Don't you be one too.